So if we're ready, board members, good morning and welcome to the Hawaii Retirement Savings Board's August 19th, 2025, 10 a.m. board meeting. My name is Alani Keoki and I'm the executive officer of the board or director. Before the meeting is called to order, the chairperson will explain the procedures to participate in this hybrid board meeting, including how members of the public can participate and interact with the board during the meeting.
Good morning, everybody. For internet access, to view the meeting and provide live oral testimony, please use the link at the top of the agenda. You'll be asked to enter your name. The board requests that you enter your full name, but you may use a pseudonym or other identifier if you wish to remain anonymous. You will also be asked for an email address. You may fill in this field with an entry in an email format. For example, yada 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 at yada yada mail.com. Your microphone will be automatically muted and video will be turned off. When the chairperson asks for public testimony, you may click the raise hand button found on your Zoom screen to indicate that you wish to testify about an agenda item. You will individually be enabled to unmute your microphone, turn on your video if you choose to, and testify. When recognized by the chairperson, please unmute your microphone and turn on your video if you choose to before speaking, and mute your microphone and turn off your video after you finish speaking. For those of you with phone access, and if you cannot get internet access, you may get audio-only access by calling the Zoom phone number listed at the top of the agenda. Upon dialing the number, you will be prompted to enter the meeting ID, which is also listed at the top of the agenda. After entering the meeting ID, you will be asked to wait to be admitted into the meeting. When the chairperson asks for public testimony, you may indicate you want to testify by entering star and then 9 on your phone's keypad. After entering star and then 9, a voice prompt will let you know that the host of the meeting has been notified. When recognized by the chairperson, you may unmute yourself by pressing star and then 6 on your phone. A voice prompt will let you know that you are unmuted. Once you finish speaking, please enter star and then 6 again to mute yourself. For both internet and phone access, when testifying, you'll be asked to identify yourself and or the organization, if any, that you represent. Each testifier will be limited to 5 minutes of testimony per agenda item. Pursuant to Act 12, Session Laws of Hawaii 2024, the board may remove or block any person who willfully disrupts or compromises the conduct of the meeting. If the connection to the meeting is lost for more than 30 minutes, the meeting will be continued on a specified date and time. This information will be provided on the board's website at labor.hawaii.gov. Instructions to attend State of Hawaii virtual board meetings may be found also online at labor.hawaii.gov. I will now do a roll call of the meeting for those attending both in person and virtually. Derek Shigano from Budget and Finance.
Present.
Here. William Kuzman, I'm also here. Jesse Keola Dean.
Here.
Present. Barbara Krieg. Here. Andrew Nomura.
Here.
Brian Taniguchi.
Here.
And we have 2 excused members, Senator Henry Aquino and Representative Jackson Sayama. I'll now call the meeting to order, and it is 10:05 a.m. The first agenda item is approval of the minutes of June the 24th, 2025. Do I have anybody from the public who wishes to provide testimony at this time?
There's none.
I see none. There is none. Does anybody on the board have any amendments to the minutes as presented in your packet? Don't believe there are any. Since there are no amendments, do I have unanimous consent to approve the minutes as presented?
Yes.
Very good. Our next agenda item is new business. And the first item underneath there, A, is fiduciary responsibilities of the Hawaii Retirement Savings Board. Deputy Attorney General Matthew Anbe will present the Hawaii Retirement Savings Board its fiduciary duties to implement and administer the Hawaii Retirement Savings Program. Do I have anybody from the public who wishes to provide testimony at this time?
I see none.
Okay, seeing there is no one to provide testimony, I will turn it over to Matt to provide his overview of the fiduciary. We continue on with Matt's
Can I start?
presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Anbe. I'm a Deputy Attorney General, Labor Division. I work with Mike Moriyama, your designated attorney. I apologize beforehand. I'm not as versed with these topics as Mike is, but I'll do my best to answer any questions. And certainly if you have any questions that can't be answered, I will pass them on to Mike. We expect that he'll be returning, I believe, in a couple of days, possibly tomorrow. So I'm gonna be primarily following Mike's outline that I believe you have received pre-meeting. It's gonna sound like a regurgitation of what's already written, and I hope that it's not received as I'm just stating something that could have easily read yourself. Like, in order to avoid missing anything that Mike deems important, I just feel that I should stick with his outline and I'll provide the information in full. And I have a few other things that I would like to add. So starting regarding fiduciary duties of the board, the board's fiduciary duties begin with Hawaii Revised Statute Chapter 389. That is the enabling statute. So 389 subsection 3 sets out the purpose of the board to implement and administer a state facilitated payroll deduction retirement savings program for private sector employees who do not have access to employer sponsored retirement plan. In addition, the board or its co-chairs with approval of the board may employ an executive director exempt from chapters 76 and 89 and other staff necessary to perform its duties. So chapter 76 is the civil service. It's a statute that addresses the civil service system merit-based principle, based on a merit-based principle. And chapter 89 is a collective bargaining statute. HRS 389 subsection 4 sets out the powers and duties of the board. Of the many powers and duties identified in 389 subsection 4, some of the provisions more relevant to the board's duty of care are as follows. Number 1, cause a program and arrangements and accounts established under the program to be designed, established, and operated in accordance with the best practices for retirement savings vehicles, to encourage participation, savings, sound investment practices, and appropriate selection of default investments, to maximize simplicity and ease of administration for employers, to minimize costs, including by collective investment and other measures to achieve economies of scale and other efficiencies in program design and administration, promote portability of benefits, and to avoid preemption of the program by federal law. So essentially, the preemption by federal law, that's just conflict of law, to avoid conflict with federal law. 2, to determine the eligibility of employer, employee, or other individual to participate in the program. 3, ensure the program's compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. 4, establish procedures for the timely and fair resolution of participant and other dispute related to account or program operation. 5, develop and implement an investment policy that defines the program's investment objectives that is consistent with the objectives of the program and other policies and procedures consistent with these investment objectives. 6, enter into contracts pursuant to Chapter 103D, that is the Hawaii Public Procurement Code. for services that the board deems necessary to carry out the purposes of this chapter, including services of private and public financial institutions, depositories, consultants, actuaries, counsel, auditors, investment advisors, investment administrators, investment management firms, other investment firms, third-party administrators, other professionals and service providers, research, technical, financial, administrative, and other services, and services of other state agencies to assist the board in the exercise of its powers and duties. In addition, number 7, ensure that all contributions to individual retirement accounts under the program may be used only to pay benefits to participants under the program, pay the cost of administering the program, and make investments for the benefit of the program, provided that no assets of the program shall be transferred to the general fund, the state, or to any other fund of the state, or otherwise encumbered or used for any purpose other than those specified. 8, evaluate the need for, and if the board deems necessary, procure insurance against any and all loss in connection with the property, assets, or activities of the program, and full private insurance. And finally, 9, collaborate with and evaluate the role of financial advisors, other financial professionals, including in assisting and providing guidance for covered employees. Moving on to HRS 389, subsection 5A. That section requires that the program shall be administered by the board in consultation with the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations and the Department of Budget and Finance. HRS 395B appears to provide the board with the discretion that prior to implementation of the program, the board may conduct a detailed implementation, evaluation study, and perform other due diligence tasks to determine the feasibility of the program parameters established by this chapter and the resources and time needed to implement the program. Upon completion of the study, the board shall report its findings and recommendations, including any proposed legislation and funding requirements, to the legislature. And should the board elect not to conduct such a study, it should have reasonable, justifiable, and articulable reasons not to have done so. HRS 395C also appears to provide, at the discretion of the board, that upon submittal of its report to the legislature pursuant to the previous section, and prior to implementation of the program, the board may determine the level of staffing necessary to implement the program, develop an implementation strategy and timetable, and conduct outreach efforts to potential covered employers and covered employees. Should the board prior to implementation of the program elect not to conduct and submit such study to the legislature, and should the board not determine the level of necessary staffing, not develop an implementation strategy and timetable, and not conduct outreach, it should have justifiable, reasonable, and articulable reasons not to have done so. HRS 389 subsection 7A requires that the program shall be managed by a program manager that shall be a financial institution with professional knowledge and experience in managing payroll deduction IRAs contracted by the board in compliance with Chapter 103D. Chapter 103D establishes state procurement procedures. Statute provides the board with some protection from liability. HRS 38910 limits the liability of the board specifically related to Chapter 389. And in addition to that, HRS 26-35.5 provides additional immunity, broad immunity, to the board and state board members in general, unless the act or omission was done with a malicious or improper purpose. Complying with and procuring goods and services through Chapter 103D, the state's procurement code can provide additional protection. Non-compliance with or procuring goods or services outside of Chapter 103 can create liability for board members. And there are limitations regarding the protection against liability of board members. This is based on case law. There's two primary cases that address this topic. In Aukuni v. Awana, which is a 2007 Hawaii case, what the Hawaii Supreme Court held that while members of state boards may not have a common law fiduciary duty, the statutory provisions of Chapter 389 be considered in identifying the duties of the board. So to explain, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Essentially, what this case stands for is that it is impliedly based on the language of the enabling statute. So as there are stakeholders as members on this board, those groups also have, or there's a fiduciary duty that extends somewhat to these groups as well. In an earlier decision, Honda v. Board of Trustees of ERS, which is a 2005 case, so it preceded the Awakuni case. The Hawaii Supreme Court initially seemed to also hold that the duties owed by the members of the state board shall be determined by their statutory mandated duties. However, the court went on to state that creation by statute does not necessarily insulate boards from common law duties. While it is unclear if the Hawaii Supreme Court's 2007 decision in Awakuni supersedes its 2005 decision in Honda, and while the Honda decision seems to render HRS 26-35.5 meaningless by imposing a greater duty on the state board members that appears to exceed the malicious and proper standards of 26-35.5. 2005 Honda decision nonetheless does exist and is considered good law. So essentially what Honda states is that although a board may be created under a statute, it is still subject to the common law duties that applies to board members or the typical type of trust or other entity. And so such duties would entail, or it would include the typical fiduciary duties: duty of care, loyalty, obedience, prudence, confidentiality, closure, oversight, and diligence. And I believe everyone is familiar with those types of fiduciary duties. So in conclusion, adherence to all statutory duties imposed on the board through chapters 389 and 103 is vitally important in determining whether the board has carried out its duties and acted without malice or impropriety. Any deviation from any statutory or other standard of care should be avoided, and if deviation is deemed necessary, the board should have reasonable, justifiable, and articulable reasons for such deviation. That is all that.
I have a couple of questions, please. First of all, regarding the section, I'm looking at pages 3 and 4, talking about the board's discretion to do certain research reports, and report back to the legislature. Is that what we've done with Pew's, or what Pew has done for us that we're seeing in this report today? Does that satisfy the requirement of the reports? And if so, how and when do we report back to the legislature?
It does appear to me that would qualify, and these efforts the involvement with Pew, I believe, would qualify as those efforts, yes.
And then what do we do about legislature? Do we rely on our legislative members to determine how and when they feel we should update the legislature? Is this an ongoing process? I mean, obviously, if we look at the proposed potential implementation plan contained in the Pew materials, thank you so much. We'll be working on this and have updates throughout the legislative session, but do we look for an initial briefing? How does that work?
Well, there's no specific deadline for the report to be submitted to the legislature. So I think once the ball starts rolling, I think we'll have better information to provide to the legislature, possibly at briefing, one of the informational briefings, it can go into the department's report that's submitted. We can in turn also submit a separate report too.
Isn't there also an annual report required by the statute as well?
20 days prior to session beginning.
Oh,
But I-
here.
But I do believe in one of your past meetings, you indicated that you did not want to submit a report to the legislature or a report in general. I believe it is at the October. And I apologize, I'll get that information and I can present it at a subsequent board meeting.
I mean, if we're required to do sort of an ongoing status report, fine, but it just seems to me that where we are now is vastly different from where we will be in January, February, March, and April.
I agree.
And rather than doing ongoing periodic reports, if we wait till we have something notable, substantial, that would be a good opportunity to put it all together. Because I also don't want Alani or anybody to be distracted by having to do reports rather than actually getting, the work done. I mean, we're in the initial stages, but we're getting really close, I think, to having real progress. So that's, if there's something clearly that we're obligated to do, we absolutely do it. But if we have, maybe Alani, if you can explore that and report back next time. And then maybe our legislative members would also have an opinion on how they think we should handle that.
Okay.
So is the question, what should constitute this report back to the legislature?
I really want to get a better feel for what are our statutory obligations with respect to this report. And if there is a broad, option, then we can determine what we think would be best, what would be a good balance. I just want to be sure we as the board are doing what we should be doing, including with respect to any legislative report.
Based on the plain reading of the statute, it certainly appears that it qualifies.
Yeah, okay, but then again, what about reporting back to the
To the
legislature?
legislature.
So my feeling was that this was exactly, the Pew materials are exactly what we needed to have in terms of our education and moving forward.
It seems like as long as you say something prior to implementation, whatever that means,
We're good.
Right.
then that's the only requirement. So it could be, I don't think we're required just to report on this. If there's other progress that's been made, as long as it's prior to implementation, that's what it sounds like to me.
And we can submit, we can submit a report. The usual deadline is 20 days prior to the legislative session beginning. And I can put this together too.
And then my other question is, Matt, you weren't here, obviously, Mike was here in a previous meeting, and it was probably shortly after Alani came on board. We actually went through, with Mike's guidance, the statutory duties and delegated authority for some of those duties to the executive director. And I'm wondering if that's something that we can have a recap on and then a revisit to make sure that we have an appropriate carve out for the executive director. Are there additional delegations needed? Are we fine with what we already have?
I can provide the past meeting minutes.
Yeah, that would be
too,
great.
on what the
Maybe
board voted
we
on.
can address that perhaps at the next meeting, again, to make sure that Alani has the tools that she needs and that we are being appropriate in how we delegate and how we keep oversight on that delegation.
Any other thoughts, comments, or questions for Matt?
Kayla's hand is raised.
Hold
Aloha. I do think that if we have the opportunity to give a report to the legislature before the start of the session, I think at a minimum we should give a report just giving them a status update, because they may not, get all the information from what we're even talking about here. So they're not necessarily going to be focused on this program. So by giving them a report, it gives them an easy opportunity to get an update from us.
Okay. Any other board members have any questions or comments?
Yeah, I think it might be good to have something probably prior to session, maybe in December, and just offer a kind of a informal kind of briefing on what's going on. We can have our two legislative members spearhead it and organize it, but maybe late November, December. December starts to get busy, but maybe around that time before the session actually starts, blowing up, that we can kind of give them just an informal briefing at their leisure. And yeah, I think that would be helpful, I think, for everyone to see where we are and how far we got. I think if you do it during session or right after session, it's sort of hard for legislators to really grasp stuff at that time. So just before session, I don't think we're going in for any kind of legislation. So um, might be even better if we do need legislation to do it at that time. About 2 months before session. Yeah.
I would just like to make a comment myself, and I think I think what we're discussing is like an information brief, yeah. And Brian probably knows better than anyone, but there's only so many info briefs that occur outside of session and outside of the money committees doing the budget ones. So I think anything outside of session would be brought, that most of the legislature would be aware of what it is and what it's about, and if they had any questions. And it might be especially beneficial at this juncture because there is a new finance chair in the house. I'm not sure to what extent he is acquainted with this program. So I would think it would be pretty helpful overall.
And if the board is inclined, and I can start meeting with legislators as well. So we can put that on a formal agenda.
Okay.
So it's similar to the reports that departments submit in response to concurrent resolutions and those types of things too.
Okay. Thank you. Good suggestions, gentlemen. And maybe. Any other thoughts or comments regarding Matt's presentation and the issues?
No hands up.
Okay, seeing none, we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the Pew Charitable Foundation presentation. John C. Scott, Project Director, Retirement Savings, the Pew Charitable Trust will provide the Hawaii Retirement Savings Board new training and, among other things, updated information regarding implementation timeline and startup and ongoing costs to run the Hawaii Retirement Savings Program. Before we turn it over to Scott, is there any members of the public who would like to provide testimony at this time?
I don't see any, Chair.
Okay, I don't see any, so we'll hand it over to you, Scott. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to present some of our work. Again, my name is John Scott, and I direct the retirement savings work at the Pew Charitable Trust. For those that don't know, Pew is a nonprofit policy research organization, and we've been working on retirement savings for a number of years now, and I've had some interaction with you folks for quite a few years. It seems like time has really flown by, but really excited that the program is on the cusp of launching. It's just really kudos to all of you. So I don't know how you'd like to proceed. Alani, I know everybody has the slides in their packets. If people want to follow along that way, or how do you want to? I can do it.
We can allow you to share your screen if
Okay.
that's easier.
Yeah, that might be easier. Let me. Of course, that assumes I can do this correctly. Let me bring up.
Alternatively, we can, I think you have to make them colors. Go.
Okay. Can you see the slides?
We can.
Good. All right. I'm not so bad at this after all. Well, again, thank you. And this presentation is in two parts. It covers the modeling work, and you have the full report in your packet of materials. So I'm really just going to be going over the highlights and really a little bit of the background behind the modeling as well, because I think that helps maybe inform you about some of the trends we're seeing around the country, and that have been built into the model over time. And then we'll pause, and any sort of questions or reactions to that modeling work, we have an opportunity to do so. And then I'm just going to very briefly talk about some of the board decisions and responsibilities, kind of following on the discussion about the fiduciary duties of the board, but maybe a little bit more targeted to what needs to be done. So why don't we get started? Let me just start. See if I can do this in a
There
second.
were even turn up this volume.
All right, do people see the, I just turned it to slideshow mode. Can you see that now?
We can.
Okay, good.
Oh, it's on.
That was fun.
Okay. I hear some conversation. Is everybody okay?
We are, but I don't think participating virtually can see.
I think you should.
We cannot see slideshow mode. We have standard mode.
Let's see. Not sure how to do that. Look at the options at the top.
I don't know if it makes it, I mean, for me, I'm fine, but I just wanted to let you know that it's not slideshow mode, because I can see all the slides going vertically down the side of the screen as well as the main slide up.
Yeah. Well,
You sharing the correct screen?
yeah, let me just move this. Bear with me a second. I have a second screen. That may be the issue, is moving this over. Okay. So apologies. Is it loading? No. Let's see. How's that?
There we go.
The virtual people are good? Okay. I think what was confusing me is I have the packet on another screen, which also has the slides. So I was kind of looking at two different versions. Okay, let's see if I can move this forward now. There we go. So as I said, we'll talk first about the financial modeling. And we performed modeling for the task force 4 years ago. In that modeling work, we found that there would be 130,000 new accounts created through a program after 15 years. And after 15 years, those accounts would generate 1.6 billion in assets. That's a very quick summary. What has changed since then? And how have the projections changed? Well, I think one of the big things is that we have a lot more data. And that has been really, really helpful in terms of calibrating a model to some of the real world data that we're seeing in the States. I mean, 12 states have now launched when only 3 were operational at the time. And in addition to all this new information, we have 2 interstate partnerships that are now in existence. And so we've been able to sort of think about how to incorporate that into a model a little bit more deftly. Fee structures have also changed. They've evolved over time, and we have better information about how different states are charging fees to accounts and to the assets. Now, that third bullet, the effective know your customer checks on the pool of workers, this was really an unknown issue, I think, back in 2021, or very much under the radar. Essentially, in this country, every financial account has to go through a know your customer check, and there are exceptions to this. But in effect, before you can open a brokerage account or a banking account or a similar account, a person's name, social security number, date of birth, and address have to check out against an external database. And if they don't, that person is blocked from opening an account. Now, as I said, there are exceptions to this. Qualified retirement plans sponsored by employers receive an exemption from these know your customer rules, but that does not apply to these state auto IRA programs like the one you're trying to set up. So the other thing to note here is with the KYC checks is that financial service providers also have some leeway on how to implement those checks. And the Treasury Department has given some guidance on how to do that. So as the state auto IRA programs have run into this issue, there's some discussion about how to properly do these checks. Some checks, many people feel, and I would agree, that some sort of check needs to be done, but maybe not the full level of scrutiny that, say, a brokerage account would receive. But the bottom line here is that these checks often weed out a number of folks who would otherwise be eligible for the program. And then the other, I think, big trend is that in 2021, we published our first report showing this, but we've had a lot more data since, that when a state starts an auto IRA program, employers often start their own retirement plan instead of enrolling their workers into the state program. And that obviously, I think that's a good thing from a public policy perspective, but it does change the pool of workers who are available to participate in the state program. So as a result of these and other factors, we've been making a number of adjustments to the model over the past few years, including benchmarking to the state data. We have more granular information about employers than we did before, so we can estimate, how many employers offer a retirement plan to their workers, what, by size of employer. We have more income data by size of employer, where we're just using basic averages. We have withdrawal behavior that's more robust. We've incorporated, job changes or churn, that people, a certain percentage of workers don't stay with their employer over a period of time. And then we've also discovered that many workers don't consistently contribute to their auto IRA accounts, that some workers contribute for a while and then they stop, maybe start up again, 6 months later. So we've tried to include a number of these factors in the model since then. One other thing too, I say we have more data, but data can be a blessing and a curse. And this slide is meant to illustrate that a little bit. So if you were to sort of look at Hawaii in relation to the other states that have programs, you have a column that represents the size of the workforce in each state, and then the number of accounts in the state auto IRA program. And when you look at this, you think, well, Hawaii is kind of similar to Maine and Delaware in terms of size. And so, we would expect maybe accounts between 6,000 and 15,000 at the end of the day. And that's not a bad way to think about it. But when you look at some of the other states, you see a lot of variability. So just going from, say, Connecticut up through Colorado, there's 4 states there with between 1.5 and 2.4, 2.5 million workers. You see a wide variance in the number of accounts. Some of that's attributable to the fact that, some of these programs are not fully implemented, so there's going to be some increases. And there's also some design issues with some of these programs that account for that variance. But also program decisions matter as well. And I think that's the one lesson I want you to take away from this, is that the size of your workforce is not necessarily going to dictate the exact size of the program itself, that you have some influence on this to some degree. just to help you understand, I'm not going to get into the weeds. I'm certainly happy to answer questions about the model, but I did want to give you a flavor of how this works because, implementing a program like this, it's important to understand, how we go from a large number of workers who don't have access to a retirement plan to a total number of accounts that are consistently contributing. And so the model starts with the employment population. We reduce it by the number of employees who are working at an employer that offer a retirement plan. So they're exempt from the program. And you'll see in that second bullet on the left, it says also self-employed independent contractors, employees ineligible for company plans. When we talk generally about workers who don't have access to a retirement plan at their job, there are a lot of workers who won't be affected directly by this program. Self-employed and independent contractors, for example, they're not employees, so they wouldn't be automatically enrolled into this program. There are also a number of employees who are not eligible for a company retirement plan, even though that company is exempt from the program because they offer a 401k, for example, but seasonal employees, part-timers, and other exemptions exist in federal pension law to exclude these workers. So you're not going to capture everybody. So there's kind of, I put it in parentheses because they're kind of left out by default, just the way everything is designed. But basically, we start with the employment population, we reduce by employees who have access to a retirement plan at their job. That gives us at the bottom the net uncovered employee population. Moving over to that middle category, we start with that net uncovered population, and then we reduce it by employees who are at employers who are starting their own plan. So these are employers that didn't offer a retirement plan, but then decided to do so because they had to make a decision about registering for the program or starting their own plan. And so this is a new assumption that we've incorporated in the model recently. Also, we've noticed across the states that employers don't always, or at least to date, a large percentage of employers don't finish enrollment or the contribution process. So you might have an employer register for the program, but they don't upload information about the employees, or maybe they upload the information about employees, but they don't get all the way to starting payroll contributions. So we've tried to incorporate that shortfalls in compliance in the model as well, based on what we're seeing in other states. I also mentioned the KYC failures, and of course, then we have opt-outs. People are given the choice to opt out, and we include that as well. And then we factor in, even if they're participating at some point, people will change jobs and fall out of the program. That gets us to total funded accounts. And then going over to the last bucket, we reduce by the number of inconsistent savers, and that gives us regularly funded accounts. So people that are consistently saving, that's really going to be the driver of your asset pool. And then from there, we're able to calculate the assets using income data and the contribution rate, and then make further adjustments for withdrawals, investment returns, fees, which of course reduce assets, but they also generate the state revenues. And then, if we're doing a cost benefit analysis, we'll look at the program budget. So I'm not going to go into the specific assumptions here. I'm happy to come back to this during the Q&A, but I just wanted to note that, give you a flavor for some of the assumptions that we've made and how they've differed. So we have the 2021 study, and then we did 2 scenarios for 2025, a baseline set of scenarios and what we're calling a conservative set of scenarios, not political conservative, but just more restrictive assumptions. You could almost say maybe a little bit more pessimistic, just to provide that sort of downside risk assessment. Looking at the 2025 baseline assumptions compared to 2021, I bolded where they differ. So we're looking at all employers with at least 1 employee. I didn't provide the estimates of how many, the percentage of employers that offer or don't offer a retirement plan, but it results in 196,559 employees who are not covered by a retirement plan. We assume that the implementation is going to be occur in one wave, and that the KYC checks will result in 25% of eligible employees being prevented from opening an account in the program. We assume that there's a yearly job change rate of 9%, and that about 1 in 4 workers will not be regular contributors to the program. The more conservative set of assumptions differ from the baseline chiefly in terms of who's not covered by a retirement plan. You can see it, that drops from 196,000 to 99,734. The KYC checks is much higher. So 4 out of 10 people are kicked out through the Know Your Customer check. And those are the big drivers of the more conservative set of assumptions. So with those assumptions in mind, oh, and just the last one is the fee schedule. So the fees, based on what we've seen around the country, fees are a bit higher than what we thought in 2021 in terms of both the asset-based fees and the account-based fees. But in terms of revenue to the state, the only real change that we've modeled is the account-based fee going from $10 per account to $4 that would flow to the state, which is a big decline in fee revenue. So the report provides a little bit more detail about the results. I'm just going to show a couple of graphs here. Just wanted to give you sort of a year-by-year picture of the total number of funded accounts. So this is all accounts, both inconsistent savers and consistent savers. So under the baseline scenario, within a few years, you reach about 45,000 accounts. And under the more conservative scenario, you're just over 20,000 accounts, again, after a few years. And it's sort of a steady state because really your growth is in the first few years with the employers that didn't have any retirement plans. We don't expect a huge deal of change under the model. I should note here too, not shown on the screen, is that we also model the number of employees who get a retirement plan because their employers decide to start their own plan. And as we show in the report, under the baseline scenario, an additional 42,100 employees get access to a retirement plan through their employer. That effectively almost doubles the number of retirement accounts, both in the program and through new employer plans. And the same with the conservative scenario, obviously just smaller. It would be an additional 13,600 accounts under private retirement plans. And then the assets flow from those projected accounts in both scenarios. I mean, you can see that under the baseline, the blue line, we're approaching 700 million in assets by the 15th year of the program. And then under the more conservative set of assumptions, it's just over 300 million by 2039. And then annual revenue, a similar kind of growth, where it's a little over $500,000 in revenue in the 15th year of the program, and then roughly about 225,000, I think, under the more conservative set of assumptions by year 15. So I'll sort of skip over this for now. This just provides sort of the basic results in more tabular or textual form as opposed to the line graphs we just saw. A little bit more of the detail, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll keep going. Now, we were asked to model some policy changes, and there were 3 that we did. So one is the use of automatic escalation of contributions, where the program default is 5% of pay. Under automatic escalation, that would increase by 1 percentage point each year until reaching a maximum of 10%. This is a fairly popular feature in many of the other state programs. And it's to help people gradually increase their savings without requiring repeated actions on their part. And the basic bottom line here, there's more detail in the report, but there would be a 61% increase in assets using automatic escalation of contributions. So that would be a big jump, as you can imagine. And then we were also asked to look at a change in the account-based fee, going from $4 an account to $6 an account. This would result in a 40 to 41% increase in revenue. And really under either the conservative or the baseline assumptions, these increases are largely the same, just operating at a different base. So, roughly a 40% increase in revenue for the fee change. And then the model did not, it didn't assume any compliance by the board or by the program, that this would be voluntary on the part of employers to comply with the program. And so we did assume that there will be some non-compliance because it was voluntary. So in this change, we assumed that there would be some enforcement efforts, or some enforcement efforts would result in some increased compliance. And to be clear, in many states that have started with enforcement efforts, it's often a series of notifications from a state agency saying, hey, you missed the deadline for enrolling in the program, please either enroll in the program or show that you have an exemption. Oftentimes these notices, in the vast majority of cases, are enough to nudge people, nudge the employers to take action one way or the other. We modeled compliance to show an increase of about, a little over 20% increase in funded accounts. So those were individual changes. If we packaged all those changes together, if the program were to do all of these at the same time, you'd see a fairly dramatic increase in the assets and other metrics. And here I'm just showing the assets. So the top two blue lines, you go from the dark blue line, which was the model output under the standard assumptions. If you packaged all those changes, you would see the light blue line. So you would be going from, roughly, I want to say, the baseline is going from nearly 700 million in assets to 1.3 million in 2039. And then under the conservative set of assumptions, you'd be going from 304 million to 589 million in 2039. And there, of course, would be a correlated increase in the fees. It's interesting, the flat fees would increase, in the first few years because of that, the flat fees or the account-based fees are taken out, in the first year that they apply. But the asset-based fees would increase gradually over time due to the automatic escalation of contribution. So you're sort of getting a dual revenue effect from these policy changes, but in different ways or different time points. So just some takeaways. We've had updated assumptions and new data, and we've revamped our model over the past few years. Not all programs are fully implemented, and there's a lot of change going on within the state programs. The model does reflect some of these experiences as best we can incorporate them into a quantitative model. We've also been able to incorporate more granular information about employers, employees, and program operations. So I think we've made some progress in getting a little bit closer to understanding how these programs operate and how, what the outcomes might look like. I think even under the most restrictive assumptions, though, the Hawaii Retirement Savings Program would have a big impact and a positive impact that would reach, tens of thousands of residents, either directly or indirectly, and that many people would have significant account balances, even after a period of 10 or 15 years. And that, maybe under a certain set of assumptions, the program revenues would not fully offset expenditures, but they would certainly represent a significant share of operating the program. And so the one thing I would just say in closing, before we sort of pause for questions and discussion, is that, design matters, external factors matter, but program decisions can have a big impact on outcomes. And, along with this, I haven't mentioned, but, we do have a federal savers match that is scheduled to be implemented in 2027. As you might have noticed, there's a little bit of, fluidity here in Washington, D.C., but we're still hopeful that the federal savers match will be available for savers in 2027, and including for those in the state programs, and that could have a huge impact on people's account balances. And then we're also working on some of these other issues like the Know Your Customer checks to maybe soften the effects of that a little bit. So with that, why don't we pause and just, Alani, maybe open it up to questions.
So as a start, John, could you elaborate, please, on this Know Your Customer check? Because having between a 25 and 40% fail rate in those models is huge and thing that we can control to minimize those rates.
Yeah, it's something that we've had some conversation with the Treasury Department. So these rules are really there's several units of the Treasury that compile these rules because they affect so many different sectors of the financial services world, and so it's a little sticky. You know, they come out of the Patriot Act and subsequent legislation from the early 2000s, and you know, but the one thing that the Treasury pointed out in the regulations is that this is, you know, financial institutions are really supposed to balance, you know, what's the gain from these checks in stopping terrorism and fraud and other crime versus the burden of doing these checks and the effect on, you know, ordinary financial transactions. And I think many financial services firms they take a conservative approach. So they, you know, often will check all of the elements of a person's file, you know, the name, the address, the date of birth, social security number. And if any one of those doesn't match, they get kicked out. And you can certainly see that if someone's social security number doesn't match, you know, they probably should not have an account. But I think for many of these workers, they don't always have a consistent address. So we've been advocating for an approach that would maybe have a softer KYC check that maybe, you know, if their name and date of birth and social security number check out, but, you know, maybe the address is not always consistent, that they can still open an account in an auto IRA program. And, you know, quite frankly, Roth IRAs, I mean, just to be sort of blunt, I mean, they're not really vehicles for terrorism and criminal transactions. You know, I think these rules are written with very different accounts in mind and very different financial transactions. And there's a reason why employer-sponsored retirement plans like 401ks are given an exemption. And I think that the argument we've been making to the Treasury and some of the service providers is that we should be thinking about auto IRA programs more like those exempted employer-provided retirement plans than brokerage accounts or checking accounts and things like that. So it's an open issue. I think we're trying to find a compromise with financial service providers and the government. You know, and even the information, you know, I think our assumptions in the model around the KYC check, I think 40% is, I mean, we have a bit of a debate about these things, like what assumptions we should use. I think that's probably too high. There is a state program that has a very high KYC failure rate, but a lot of the other states have much lower rates. So I think that's something we could play with, you know, if we rerun the models, we can sort of maybe lower the rate and see what happens to the accounts. I hope that answered your question.
It does, but sort of a corollary. Are you aware of the extent to which the already implemented state auto IRA programs devote internal resources, you know, administrator resources to work with the employees to see if they can clear up whatever discrepancies are coming up on these checks?
I don't. I think it's that is a good question.
I mean, there have to be some clerical errors, right? Clerical errors, or somebody has moved recently, you know, those sorts of issues.
Absolutely. And, you know, the service providers, you know, it's not the case that if you fail one data element that they're like, okay, that's it, you're out. I mean, they make some effort to validate your information using other data sources. I mean, as you can imagine, much of this is automated at first, and then they sort of look at the failures and they try and manually check to make sure that, you know, maybe it's the database itself that might be wrong. You know, we've also suggested solutions, and this is just discussion. It's not, you know, we're still in sort of the early stages of this, but for example, if someone's failing on their address, you know, why not use the employer's address as a substitute? So there is some conversation about how to deal with this and maybe figure out a way that works for all the parties involved and then also meets the public policy goal.
So John, and as a follow-up question, you mentioned that there's some states that are significantly higher as far as failure rate. So that implies that there's some sort of policy question or policy implementation at the state level that's impacting that number. I mean, is it, are we as a group here kind of responsible for making those kinds of criteria?
I think it's probably a conversation to have with the service providers. I think a lot of this is driven by the demographics of a particular state. So some, state demographics vary, to a fair degree. And that's always been my assumption as the main driver. But you do have two service providers. So these checks are not done by the government. They're done by the financial service providers. And the service providers have their own policies and their own ways of trying to correct for this. So I think that's really a conversation to have with them when you get to the point of RFPs to run the program, is how do you handle the KYC checks? Is there flexibility in the system, et cetera, et cetera.
I had a question on going alone versus partnerships, and how does that impact the assumptions in your modeling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we modeled it in this report. It's something we could do. What I've seen in the past when we've modeled it is, often the question is, because we didn't really get into state revenues versus costs of running the program. Oftentimes when we do that, we do look at joining a partnership versus going alone, because in a partnership, it's really are you able to reduce your costs? That's certainly something we could look at. But I think in terms of the outputs that we showed you in this report, assets, accounts, revenues to the state, what we've seen in prior work done for other states is that the big benefit from the interstate partnerships is that you're able to get the program off the ground more quickly. And that has a big impact, on the generation of assets. I mean, you're still going to have roughly the same number of accounts being opened. That's not really going to be affected to a great degree by joining an interstate partnership. But if you can sort of, not have to reinvent the wheel and join the partnership, you can get off the ground more quickly and you can start generating assets more quickly. And then that compounding of the returns will help build the assets more quickly. So I think that's the main effect of joining the interstate partnership in terms of the metrics I showed today.
I guess it'd be good if we had it in the charts. Then it's almost that we should be in some sort of partnership, but I don't want to make that assumption that's.
It seems that way to me too.
I mean, but it's sort of, is it so obvious that we just go in that direction, or how do we proceed to get to that point?
I was hoping that we would have a September board meeting and we invite the executive director from the Colorado board, as well as the executive director. I don't know if she's in the meeting today, but Angela with Georgetown, and they can go over some of that information. But I have collected information from Colorado RFPs, some of their agreements with their state partnerships, as well as their agreement with the investment vendor that they're using, Vestral. So I was hoping we could meeting too. Oh, I'm sorry, Kayla.
Oh, yeah, I noticed in the second set of slides, so looks like someone else is presenting. There is some discussion of the multi-state compacts. So I'm wondering if there's a little more information from that presentation.
Yeah, I think I'm doing a part 2 where I do bring that up a little bit, but I think Alani makes a good point that she's been collecting information. You'll hear from, I think Hunter Raley from the Colorado program, which has sort of been one of the two hubs for interstate partnerships, and he's a really good expert on how it works, operationally.
What is the other hub?
It's brand new. It's Connecticut and Rhode Island. And other states have talked about this too. So there's a lot of interest in interstate partnerships.
Yeah.
Is there any of the small states gone alone?
Testing my knowledge, I want to say no. I believe Maine and Vermont are in the Colorado partnership.
So there was one jurisdiction who had a program similar to our old program or our old statutes where it was a voluntary opt-in. And that was New Mexico. But I think they put their program on hold indefinitely.
They have. Yes. Yeah, and I think what happens, I think what a lot of the states that are smaller in population have found out is that it's hard to get bids from financial service providers if you try and go standalone. The providers are looking for scale.
I see
Yeah,
Andrew.
John. Yeah. Oh,
Hi, Andrew from Pew, and I was just going to chime in there as well. I think the smallest state that's going it alone is Oregon, the first state to launch. And that's just really a product of the fact that they were the first state and there was no partnership to be had at the time.
yeah. Yeah, I got a question about fee structure. I guess when we were first talking about this back in the old days, we had talked about a lower percentage for the contractor as well as a larger amount that went back to the state, so that I guess within 10 to 12 years, the state would make the money it had invested would make its money back, and I guess start even making. So it seems as if the fee structure has doubled, from that 0.15 that we had talked about earlier. It's now 2.29%. And I just want to know, is that what is being charged currently? Is it because of a lack of interest by the financial institutions, or yeah?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's keep in mind that there's some variability around the fee structures on a state-by-state basis. But there's no question that the fees have gone up since 2021. Especially the financial service providers, they're gaining some experience with the program, how much it's costing them to run the call centers and do the outreach and all the functions that they provide, and the investment management. And so I think they've been able to negotiate some higher fees to reflect the cost that they're experiencing. So I think that's been the main reason why you see that increase in fees from 2021 to today. Has
Oregon maintained its fee structure?
No, it's changed over time as they've negotiated their contracts.
Yeah, it would seem to me that as the amount of monies in the accounts becomes larger, that the amount of work that the amount of work that the contractor does is less. But
no, that's right. And I believe, I'm not a party to their contracts, but the way I understand it is that, and this is true, I believe, with the interstate partnerships, that as the assets increase, the fees, they hit certain breaks that the fees will go down.
Okay.
So, again, that's something to be negotiated and understand from the service providers when you send out your RFPs. But and again, I think that's you're going to hear me harping about the interstate partnerships, but that's an advantage of the interstate partnerships, is that you're contributing to a larger pool. You'll get the advantage of those fee breaks a little more quickly.
And then that $4 or $6 fee to the state, It's less. Is there a sense of, I guess, how much money the state will get back from its investment into this program?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we didn't explicitly model. I mean, I guess, Brian, what you're asking is, what's sort of the payback, or, when do you sort of break even, essentially. We didn't explicitly model that. That's something that we could certainly take a look at. We can work with Alani on that. We had some. We can certainly take a look at some assumptions about what you think would be.
Yeah. No, I would. Yeah, I would think that. Yeah, once we kind of make our money back and we have enough to support the staffing and whatever programs we have associated with it, that we could then begin to have that, I guess, give that back to the employees. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first one's in regards to the auto escalation. So, in the bullet points, it talks about reaching, until 10%. Unless they actively choose a different rate. So in the other states, do they limit it to 10%, or, if it gets to 10%, then the participant can choose to, contribute more, or?
Yeah, they can. Some people out of the gate contribute a lot more, but they're sort of a tiny minority. Most people, when they're defaulted in at, say, 5% of pay, you don't see anybody really changing their contribution rates. And that's the same with auto escalation. Most people, it's the adage of set it and forget it, that they just let that go. And that's why it's important to have a maximum contribution rate, whether it's 8% or 10%. But we don't see a lot of changes, affirmative changes by the participants.
Okay, thank you. And then for the board, if the board is interested in this kind of thing, that's part of the program design that presumably would be in administrative rules, or is that the way you see it on?
Administrative rules, you can put that in administrative rules. You don't necessarily want to put it in your statutes.
Right, and then so if it's in the administrative rules, then presumably that has an impact on the liability of the board itself, right? And I'm asking the AG, but I mean, that would seem to be would support the, fiduciary responsibilities being carried out.
That would, yes, that would appear to be the case.
Yes, that's a public process. And then, so my other question in regards to, is in regards to the flat annual fee. That would be similar as well. That would be something that the program design, which should be through administrative rules, and presumably the board would set forth, here's the sort of how we sort of want the program designed or whatever, and then the executive director would take that and translate that into administrative rules, and then come back before the board for review and approval to start that process.
Public hearing process.
Public, yeah.
Presumably that's the road, because we'd have to make sort of the bigger decisions first before we got into the details of what goes in the admin rules, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So making clear, the opt-out process, for example, for employees, we want to be sure that that's set out in the admin rules so that that's clear. Right?
Yeah.
So just for the public's information, the board members are referring to the document Q Hawaii Retirement Savings Program Modeling, page 11. So this report is posted to the board's webpage under board packet.
So to follow up on that, if I may, so sometimes when the legislature passes new laws that include rulemaking, sometimes the department will sort of operate it for a little while before it does administrative rules, because that kind of boxes you in, so to speak. But in this situation, it would seem like you'd want to have administrative rules kind of to come out of the gate. So does the board see the administrative rules process as necessary to launch the program?
I personally have been assuming that yes, we would, because as an example, I mean, at least on some of the processes, because the employers are going to need to know, right? And the way I had assumed that we would be responsible for making a lot of those decisions. You know, maybe if I'm wrong, then that's fine too, because admin rules are not easy and quick to get into. But my fear is that, you know, as a board member, I don't know what I don't know, you know, and as we would work through what would be in the admin rules, we would be answering all sorts of questions that employers and employees would be coming up with in terms of how does this program operate, right?
So because the process does take, and it can take years sometimes, but I'm not planning on it to take years. Would we be able to do that through policy as well, as long as it's documented in meeting minutes? Again, I mean, this is a brand new program. Rules can take months, if not years. And to wait for that process to complete, because you have to get a draft, you all have to review it, you make your changes. Then a public hearing has to be held, and then it goes to small business. All of that.
I don't know. Sorry. I have to ask that question on to Mike.
So maybe we can get that as an agenda item, if not for September, you know, for October, in terms of what can be done prior to administrative rules being finalized. And if so, if we can do that, what documentation format would that take to be sure that we are in fact complying with our duties and doing the appropriate, you know, oversight? Because it may be also that, you know, the compacts, you know, and the service providers have already gone through this, right?
Yeah. So if we were to join a compact, that would provide a lot of the.
That's
lot of the
80%
procedures.
right there. Seems like you just,
That is my hope.
Right, talk
Yeah.
about not having to reinvent the wheel.
that's the reinvention.
Yeah. Okay. And then if I may, I had one other question for Scott in regards, in looking at that same section on page 11, about the enforcement. So in these other states, how do they go about the enforcement piece, and what kind of staffing does that involve?
Great question. The short answer is it depends. Different states have different, and can be a function of their statute, or it can be somewhat a little bit of a gray area, but different states will, oh, I shouldn't say different states. Most states will partner with another agency. So the program will partner with another agency that might be the Department of Revenue or Department of Labor, you know, that has the ability to issue notices. You know, it obviously depends on what the statute provides in terms of how the compliance system works and the penalties. But more often than not, it's typically another state agency, or I should say a state agency, that sends out a series of notices. And, you know, typically you might think of it as like, you know, 3 sets of notices. They get progressively, you know, more insistent. But the idea is really just to, you know, I think for a lot of employers, you know, they just, especially small business owners, they're busy. They maybe don't notice the notices from the program itself, but they often will notice a letter from the Department of Revenue, for example, or the State Attorney General's office, or whatever the agency might be. So, you know, I think that's usually the plan, is to work with other executive agencies to, carry out the notifications. I don't have any data, but very little in terms of fines have been collected in this process. I mean, the vast majority of employers, respond to those notifications and either exempt themselves or register for the program.
Okay, so the actual entity that is the administrative entity carrying out the program actually doesn't have its own enforcement staff for the most
Yeah.
part.
Yeah, that's right. And that could be, again, I haven't reviewed your statute closely on this point, but sometimes it's I know that the Hawaii statute does provide for contracting with other agencies, and it might be that you contract with, I'm just going to make this up, the Department of Revenue, but they may say, it's going to cost us $50,000 to do this, and so you sort of pay for that. So that's one way it could work.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful for our department and our state. I think it would be an easier scenario to try to do something within the walls as a DLIR as opposed to going to a different state agency. And there's various, we have a few different programs involved in enforcement, of course, but one of those is federal, which is the Unemployment Insurance Division. And then there's a general funded one, Wage Standards, which does do the wage and hour, prevailing wages, that kind of stuff. So just off the top of the head, there's a couple of options there. One would be a lot more expensive. That would be to reimburse the federal program, because the federal program, unemployment insurance, cannot spend any of its money on anything other than unemployment insurance.
So just for my information, do any other divisions contract with them or enter into some form of a memorandum with UI or Wage Standards?
Or
Any kind of investigative enforcement purposes?
Don't believe so. There's data memorandums understanding. And I think that's one thing the board might consider, because if you look at the universe of who's out there for employers or whatever, of course, the unemployment insurance information is the gold standard. And it's not only within the department, but across state government and a whole bunch of other places. And then there is a data task force that was established by the legislature in the last session that is also looking at how the state collects data and looking at potential efficiencies or centralization of that among other issues too. So that is something that could develop over the course of the next 5 years that may have an impact on how the board is able to access and obtain and use data as well. But
And that's a DLIR mandate?
no, that's a executive branch one that DAGS is actually the lead on. ETS, I forget what the acronym means. That's our
Right.
state's centralized IT. Okay, well, thank you. That's
Any other questions? Yep.
Okay. Well, I know it's getting, well, it's not late there, but I know the meeting, we don't have a ton of time. And I did want to, let me see if I can get back to my slides. There we go. I did want to talk a little bit about key board responsibilities and decisions, and quite a bit of this we've kind of covered to some degree. So I'll probably skip through some of the slides. And again, we can go back to some and if you have questions. But I think the State Attorney General's Office did a nice overview of the fiduciary roles. Those do flow into your powers and duties, which they discussed. I'll focus mostly on the implementation due diligence and preview of key decisions, though, just in the interest of time. I think the state attorney general's representative did a nice job here. The one thing I would say, as a recovering pension attorney, the one key thing to remember, whether it's federal or state law, is that the fiduciary duties just basically can be summed up as, always act in the best interests of participants. And so any of these sort of roles that you have, the deliberation, the planning, oversight, determining what the fee is and how to enforce timely payroll contributions, all these, transparency, all these things, that fiduciary responsibility flows through all of that. This was discussed a little bit. The one thing I do want to make a note here, so there was the presentation on, that you design, implement, and maintain or administer the program with the following goals in mind. There was the point about maximizing simplicity and ease of administration for employers. And I think that's really important. Employers are a key part of this process because they provide the mechanism of payroll deduction. So I think just in terms of having a good program, that's a key goal to keep in mind. The other thing that it was kind of alluded to in the state AG's presentation was the reference to federal fiduciary law, which is in ERISA, which is the federal pension law. And so a lot of the idea of, there's a secondary kind of underlying goal here with maximizing simplicity is that, we want to make this easy for employers so that they don't trigger federal pension law. Federal pension law is triggered when an employer has discretion over a retirement program. And so, making this as easy and light touch as possible for employers also has that added benefit of insulating this program from any federal pension law considerations. One thing I just wanted to note too, and this is kind of a key theme for me at least, is there's a number of provisions in the enabling statute that refer to outreach and education. So developing and implementing an outreach plan to gain input and disseminate information regarding the program. I think you have to think about this in terms of different audiences. And as I mentioned with the prior slide, employers are a key audience in any sort of outreach plan, in addition to employees and other stakeholders in the state. There's a separate provision in the law that's relevant, I think, to this point, is that, the program should collaborate with and evaluate the role of financial advisors and other financial professionals. Hawaii has many of these experts who can be helpful to the program, both in providing advice in terms of best practices, but also in helping disseminate, messages about the program. We've talked to a number of financial professionals around the country who really sort of think this is a good idea, and it's be a good idea to kind of leverage that community within your state. And then, of course, there's the other provision, which is designing a program to educate covered employees, about the impacts of participating in the program, affecting their take-home pay, saving strategies, and the benefits of planning and saving. So this is much more of a financial education goal. But I've always believed strongly that state programs can be a great platform for reaching people, not just about how the program operates, but also to help them on a number of financial issues. So it may not be your immediate goal of getting the program off the ground, but maybe more of a long-term goal once you get established and up and running. I won't really talk about this. So let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, I mean, just the point I was going to make here about contracting is it obviously includes private vendors, whether that's outside legal counsel, the investment managers, plan administrators. There is a provision for research and technical services, so groups like Pew or Georgetown or whomever, but also state agencies, and that's also in the statute that you can contract with state agencies to provide data as well as that enforcement piece that we were talking about. So just wanted to focus a little bit about implementation due diligence. You as a board have the discretion to determine what the timeline is, how quickly or how slowly you want to roll the program out. You can conduct a detailed implementation and evaluation study, and I know that was discussed in the first presentation. And I think the modeling work that Pew has done, and I do want to, by the way, give credit to Andrew Blevins, who's on this call. He's the one that did the lead on the modeling work, and he deserves all the credit for it. He did a great job. But if there's additional work that you would like done, we're certainly happy to do that for the program. So any sort of what if scenarios, that's not a problem. But I think this section here was covered. So finally getting to this preview of key board decisions around implementation. And you have a broad responsibility to develop a plan and timeline around the implementation of the program. So what are the steps needed to get this program off the ground, and how quickly or how slowly? That involves developing RFPs for, if you decide you want that sort of help, a program consultant, an investment consultant, a program administrator, the one that's actually doing the record keeping and communications work, as well as the investment managers, the ones providing the investments. In addition, you might consider an RFI or RFP for the state partnerships. I know you're going to have a conversation next month with Colorado, as well as with Georgetown. They're going to provide a lot of information about the partnerships, but you might consider sending out some requests for information to other states about their experience with the partnerships and the pros and cons, that kind of thing, before going to an RFP. Part of the implementation is thinking through what kind of outreach and education you want to do, what needs to be done, how do you want to do it, who's going to do it. Is it just going to be Alani? Is it going to be all of you? Are you going to contract that outreach? I think this is one of the key things that has to happen even before you start taking in people's savings. And then, of course, what we've all been talking about the whole time is the issue of standalone program versus participation in a multi-state partnership or consortium. We've already talked about what's available, but a key question is, how does it fit with your program? How does it fit with your state and your residents? And then, what are the intended launch steps and timeline? So I put together here, this is just my product. It shouldn't be taken as the gospel truth of how you have to implement a program, but just thinking through a little bit about, if you want to get this program up and running with people actively saving by July 1st, 2026, so a little less than a year away, what might that look like? So from now through September, you want to review information about the program modeling, which we've done today, as well as other state programs, which you're going to do next month. Set expectations for when you're going to start making decisions on what decisions. Obviously, get some questions and air the concerns amongst the board membership, and then make some decisions around whether it's going to be a partner or standalone program. What are the costs and risks and opportunities of either choice? And then from there, develop that and review that implementation plan. What are the intended launch steps and the timeline? And then in October through December, this is kind of the due diligence part, where you request and review information from the partners. You could obviously do this a little bit earlier, but what is offered to Hawaii, what is required of Hawaii, and then the cost, responsibilities, and rollout in a more fine-grained sense. RFPs and contracting should probably be done during this time period. And then the key decisions here would be the selection of the actual partnership, if you're going to go that route, initiating that agreement process, I should say negotiating and initiating that agreement process, making decisions into rulemaking. You were talking about rulemaking before. It probably would be a good idea, and this will be helpful to talk with Colorado next month. Are there any sort of changes or adjustments that need to be made to the program to be able to fit into that interstate partnership? And then adjust, if as needed, your implementation plan. And then we get into 2026, beyond just finalizing that plan, start conducting that rulemaking activity, ideally maybe even before, but start soliciting pilot employers and begin to engage with them, and then finalize program materials that are going to go out to both employers and employees. And then April to June, it's promotion, it's initiating the pilot. Almost all the programs have started with a pilot program of, between 20 and 100 employers to make sure that, the tires can be kicked and the pipes work. And then from there, if everything goes well, start launching the program in July. That's an aggressive timeline, but just wanted to give you a sense of, just my input about your responsibilities and how they might fit into a flow there. But I imagine Alani and the rest of you can do a much better job improving upon that. So I think with that, I just have some key takeaways, but about the fiduciary responsibilities. I do want to stress this middle point about outreach and education. One of the first people working in the Oregon Saves program told me, they said, we wish we had spent more time and more money on outreach and education, and particularly to employers. And so I think that's something to really keep in mind as you move forward. And then finally, there's a lot here, but I think it can be done efficiently and feasibly with an eye towards 2026. So I'll just stop there and take any questions, if any.
I had a comment about your financial advisors. I think the financial advisors would be key as far as accessing employers. So those are, you're going to get to them through the financial advisors, and then financial advisors can advise them whether or not they can go it alone. I mean, the employers can set up their own plans, or they can work with the state. So those, I think that's a key access point to getting employers on board.
And I believe Kayla made that suggestion as well, the last couple meetings, right?
Business owners are busy, and they'll look to a person they view as the expert, and that could be a financial advisor, investment advisor, a bookkeeper, CPA. You can think broadly about what you mean by financial advisor, but it's a great community to partner with.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Okay. Being none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the Executive Director's Report, including the 2025 ethics training and a reminder from the Hawaii State Ethics Commission regarding board and commission members' mandatory ethics training requirement.
So yes, there's an entire packet in your board meeting packet. It's just a reminder that this particular board and the members of this board are subject to the ethics training requirement. All of you are compliant, but I just want to keep this on the agenda when we do receive notices from the Ethics Commission. So thank you for being compliant.
We're not in the 4 year. We're not.
Good.
This is the 4th year.
No, you're part of the 4-year group. You take it every.
So I mean, I personally checked my records. I did my initial training. It was 2 years ago, 2023. So I don't think anybody
Is
would have done it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Done it any earlier.
So if we can go back, I just want to personally thank John and Andrew for working with me, getting the information that the board needs to make informed decisions. So thank you very much for spending countless days and hours working on this information.
Thank you. That was a
Thank
great
you.
presentation. Thank you. Great materials.
Okay, next agenda item is our next meeting, which as discussed will be in September of 2025, which will also be a hybrid meeting, virtual via Zoom as well as in person here at 830 Punchbowl Street.
So for board members, if I'm unable to get quorum for September, the meeting is still scheduled for October. I'll send out again the board meeting schedule to all members to have on file.
Do you know when the September meeting is supposed
Now I'm gonna send out
to be? No, you haven't.
a poll for you all. Okay,
Great.
great. Thank you. So the meeting is adjourned at 11:41 a.m. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Phenomenal.
Bye, everybody.
The